Okay, it's 12 o'clock. Welcome on behalf. Is everybody here, by the way? Can everybody hear me and see me? Hello, everybody?
Hi.
Okay.
Hi.
Okay. All right. On behalf of the team at Covert Action Magazine, welcome everyone to this webinar entitled How to Protect and Empower Whistleblowers in an Era of Rampant Government Criminality. My name is Chris Agee, and I'm the executive editor of Covert Action Magazine and the son of Philip Agee, the ex-CIA case officer turned whistleblower. His 1975 blockbuster expose of the CIA called Inside the Company CIA Diary named all the names and operations of assets and activities primarily operating in Latin America. His revelations joined the chorus of anti-US government sentiment following the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, the Watergate, and a whole host of other embarrassing disclosures, including Daniel Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers and the Church and Pike investigations. On the one hand, their work and the work of Covert Action Magazine and the work of many other whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and publications has laid bare for the world, for all to see the dirty tricks of the US government and what it was up to and what it is up to still to this day. On the other hand, we now have, to add to the 1917 Espionage Act, the draconian 1982 Intelligence Identities Protection Act. These are tools used to silence those who wish to go public and expose the US government crimes and human rights abuses. To shed light on all of this, we will hear today from two recent whistleblowers, JESSELYN RADACK, who as an attorney represents numerous whistleblowers, including Edward Snowden, JOHN KIRIAKOU, ex-CIA case officer who exposed the CIA official torture program. We will also hear from Kathy Kelly, a noteworthy peace and anti-drone activist who will speak on the horrors of drone assassinations. We are honored with your presence here today and for all the great work you all are doing. We are also honored to have all of you who are attending this webinar and watching online. We look forward to hearing from you, and to those of you attending, you'll have a chance to ask questions for our speakers during the Q&A session of this webinar. Please write your questions in the chat, and we will curate those questions for the speakers. Now, Jeremy Kuzmarov, our managing editor, will introduce the speakers in more detail. Each speaker will be introduced with a short video to promote some context. After all, three speakers present, we will hold the 30-minute question and answer session, which should provide ample time for your questions. Now, Daniel Hale could not be with us today. Apparently, he has been taken into custody early. Daniel had the courage to expose the truth of horrendous drone war crimes. He is facing years behind bars while the criminals go free. Daniel will be sentenced on July 13th, I believe. With
Correct.
Daniel, is that correct? Yes?
That is correct, yes.
Yes. With Daniel, Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, Reality Winter, among others, in jail, we thought it prudent to host this webinar to discuss how to protect and empower them and future whistleblowers that go public and speak truth to power. My father dedicated his life to blowing the whistle. He also made it his life's work to take on the establishment with no holds barred. He was passionate about organizing and empower people all around the world to build for fundamental social change. So let me take also this opportunity to invite you all to get more involved. Feel free to reach out to us. We need to build this movement to not only protect and empower whistleblowers, but continue to expose the crimes of the US government and plutocrats worldwide. During our discussion today, we should keep in mind my father's overarching message. The military and intelligence establishment is a tool for US imperial interests to dominate the world for cheap access to markets, labor, raw materials, and geopolitical control. It is this structural context that we need to understand as we struggle for a more just, truly democratic world that embraces diversity, a healthy environment, and socioeconomic justice for all. Transparency is crucial for accountability. And whistleblowers are on the front lines, exposing torture, summary executions, war crimes. These are not crimes. Nor is it treason, as one writer has titled a new biography of my father. What's ironic is that in the very text of the biography, the very crimes my father exposed are there. And that is scheduled to come out in 3 days. But what's ironic is that the author just disproves his very thesis. The author recounts the very crimes my father exposed, crimes that any half-moral person would recognize and object to. And now, before we hear from our speakers, let me turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Lou Wolf, the one remaining original co-founder of Covert Action magazine, who worked all his life with my father to expose covert action and the nefarious activities of US imperialism. All right, Lou, so are you there? Go ahead, Lou.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I met Philip Agee in London at his first public speaking event after the 1975 publication of his blockbuster Inside the Company, CIA Diary. He told me later he thought the CIA had sent me to get close to him, while I said, I'm surprised the CIA has not killed you. Within minutes, we embraced, and I told him I wanted to help him unconditionally. Over the next 2 years, I met with Phil in his residences in Hamburg, Amsterdam, Cambridge, and in London, all the while as the CIA successfully lobbied each of 7 countries to deport him. And the State Department and Supreme Court canceled his passport, just the second time in history after this was done in 1950 to Paul Robeson. In 1977 and 78, we met in Washington with Bill Schaap, Ellen Ray, and we decided to start a magazine then called Covert Action Information Bulletin, later renamed Covert Action Quarterly. Our co-founders included Bill Kunstler, Michael Ratner, Elsie and Jim Wilcott, and of course, Chris Agee. And also Bill Kunstler and Bill Kunstler. Our first office of several was in the National Press Building, coincidentally on the same floor as investigative journalist Seymour Hersh. When George H.W. Bush announced in 1990 his dislike of broccoli, we printed a cartoon of a conveyor belt loaded down with broccoli going in the front door of the White House. Between 1978 and 2005, our award-winning magazine published major investigative articles on Pentagon chemical biological warfare research, the Ku Klux Klan, the CIA in Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Guyana, Nicaragua, Angola, South Africa, the Seychelles, Spain, Italy, Scandinavia, Vietnam, and Laos, the NSA in Norway, the Union Carbide gas disaster in Bhopal, India, the secret CIA propaganda budget, CIA assassinations, opposing CIA recruitment, and a top secret deep cover manual, and much more. Honoring Philip Agee and the work of whistleblowers, we decided in 2017 to relaunch the magazine exclusively online as Covert Action Magazine. We are now in our 43rd year. That's it for me.
Okay, well, I'm Jeremy Kuzmarov, and I'm the managing editor of Covert Action Magazine. So I started working this great publication this summer, and yeah, we published a lot of articles, on many important topics and exposés, and we hope to do more. And we've also, tried to feature whistleblowers and their revelations. Today's webinar focuses on 2 themes: the government's increasingly harsh and unjust persecution of whistleblowers and how to fight it. And secondly, the immorality and illegality of America's murderous drone bombings and commitment to endless wars. Whistleblowers have existed in the United States, before Philip Agee. In fact, going back to the Revolutionary War, when two sailors, Samuel Shaw and Richard Marvin, spoke out after witnessing the torture of British POWs by a high-ranking naval officer who happened to be commander-in-chief of the entire Continental Navy. The military establishment quickly struck back. The two sailors were court-martialed, dismissed from the Navy, and subjected to costly lawsuits. But they appealed to Congress for justice, and happily they were ultimately vindicated by Congress, which paid for their legal defense, and in 1778 enacted by unanimous vote the first whistleblower protection law. Sadly, the fate of subsequent whistleblowers has been less happy, as successive US presidents began to ignore the intent of this statute, as well as the many later statutes passed by Congress to protect whistleblowers. The reason was spelled out by a Rutgers historian, Lloyd Gardner, in a book on whistleblowing, who wrote that whistleblowers are more dangerous than common criminals because they challenge the legitimacy of the state. Although one of our board members, Steve Brown, who's with us, made the point that state policy can actually be changed, and that these whistleblowers who we've seen who've been treated very harshly, including some who we have today, John Kiriakou and JESSELYN RADACK, who's defended them, Manning, Snowden, Daniel Hale, Brown makes the point that they challenge the legitimacy of certain state actors and the destructive consequences of what they have done, allowed to be done or abetted. These powerful state actors, whether elected officials, military commanders, or heads of intelligence agencies or presidents, fear being exposed by these whistleblowers because of potentially career-shattering embarrassment, not to mention long prison terms. So not unexpectedly, they use their power to protect themselves by prosecuting the whistleblower, diverting public and judicial attention away from the criminals and their crimes onto the alleged criminality of the whistleblower. Thus, at bottom, it is not the state that is punishing the whistleblowers, but the criminal state actors who use the levers of state machinery to protect themselves personally. Whistleblower prosecutions are never about lofty and value-driven issues as they pretend to be, but about low and venal ones. Few see this and mistakenly condemn the state for overreaching when the overreach is by key state actors operating the levers of the state on their own behalf. So our first speaker, John Kiriakou, is a victim of this process. He spent over a year in jail for helping to expose unethical torture program in the War on Terror. And he's going to speak about his experience and the Obama administration's policy and how we may be seeing continuity in the Biden administration, what we might do collectively to try and combat this unjust approach. Our second speaker, Kathy Kelly, will detail the ravages of the drone war and U.S. endless wars in the Middle East. She has traveled to these war zones and been arrested numerous times as a peace activist. And she has some experience with drones. Over email, she told me she has interviewed people, in Lebanon subjected to drone surveillance, and in Afghanistan interviewed a woman by phone whose son was killed by a drone, and has studied these reports about U.S. drone attacks, including those that killed civilians, like in Afghanistan. One particular attack killed 30 migrant laborers harvesting pine nuts in the Wazir Tangi district of Nangarhar province. And this relates, our third speaker, JESSELYN RADACK, is herself a whistleblower related to a legal advice she had given about the right of the John Walker Lean, who was accused of fighting with the Taliban, to an attorney. And she was persecuted herself and has fought back by defending many whistleblowers. And her latest client is Daniel Hale, who exposed the drone war. And what Kelly will be describing, he helped to inform the public about what was going on. And what's particularly valuable in some of the documents he provided to The Intercept was its revelations about the inner workings of the drone war. He exposed how a lot of the victims were not the people originally targeted. And he also showed the inner workings and the kind of sick element that the members of the Obama administration had developed baseball card. What came out from some of those documents, they set up baseball cards making a kind of a game out of this killing, which is really kind of twisted if you think about it. And he's the one being punished, sadly. He was a drone operator himself who manned many hours and was a person of conscience like Philip Agee, who saw that this was morally wrong. So let me turn it over. We're going to start with John Kiriakou, but we have a video first, and then we'll get to him. So Chris will display the video.
Okay, so let me just display the video. And here we go, right here. Let's let me know if you can actually see the video. When you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes.
Can everybody see it and hear it?
I see it.
Yes.
In January of 2012, the FBI called me at home and said, "Can you come to the Washington field office Thursday at 10? Okay. I said, "Absolutely." So I went down to the Washington field office and they began asking me questions. Well, I've spent my entire adult life working with the FBI. So the FBI needs my help. I'm happy to help. It wasn't until I was about an hour and 45 minutes into this interview that I realized, wait a minute, they're investigating me. We need to be honest. And they said, well, we need to be honest with you. We're executing a search warrant on your house right now as we speak, and we're seizing all of your electronics.
What I experienced as a whistleblower who sends the most chilling of messages about what the government can, and I will emphasize, will do when one speaks truth to and of power.
There is information that the public in a functioning democracy has a right to know.
What does it do? So your whole body rails against it?
Wordless wiretapping, torture. We only know about that because of whistleblowers.
I knew I could not remain silent. If I remained silent, I'd be complicit to the subversion of the Constitution. If I remained silent as a senior executive assigned to the National Security Agency, I would be an accessory to a crime.
Historically, such people were forced to choose between their conscience and their career. But now the stakes are much higher. They risk their freedom and their lives.
I did not commit a crime. I am going to trial and I'm going to prove myself innocent. I'm not the pushover that these guys think I am. I'm as tough as they are, and I'm going to fight.
All right, were you guys able to hear that video and hear it and see it?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, John, take it away.
The bad old days, right, Jess?
Yeah, absolutely.
First, I want to say that I spoke with Daniel Hale yesterday. He called me from the Alexandria Detention Center. I was shocked. And he wanted me to let everybody know that what the government has leaked about this is a lie, which shouldn't be any surprise to us. There's a rumor out there that he tested positive for marijuana. He said it's absolutely false. He did not. He was called and told to go into the Alexandria Federal Courthouse here in the Eastern District for a routine urinalysis. He said he was clean. He drove over there or went over there with a full bladder and was handcuffed and arrested. And they told him that they had heard that he was suicidal, which he swears he was not, and that they were arresting him for his own safety. Well, now he's suicidal because he's in solitary confinement. This is just one of those tricks, one of those underhanded tricks that the government uses. Now, Chris posed a question in the very beginning of what can we do? How can we defend ourselves? Well, I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. And let me tell you why. My own experience, and I know that you'll hear this from JESSELYN as well, and from virtually any other whistleblower, is the deck is so stacked against us that there's virtually no way to be proactive. You have to be reactive. Forgive me if I'm repeating myself here, but two of the strategies that the government uses that really do most of us in are venue shopping and charge stacking. Now, venue shopping is where they will charge you in the federal district where you are the most likely to be convicted and the most likely to receive a long sentence. That's why so many of us have been charged in the Eastern District of Virginia. It's called the Espionage Court. And it's called the Espionage Court because no national security defendant has ever won a case there. It's no mystery why, for example, General Petraeus, after exposing the names of 10 covert CIA operatives to his adulterous girlfriend, was charged not in the Eastern District of Virginia, but in the Western District of North Carolina. And after he was sentenced on a misdemeanor charge of mishandling classified information and sentenced to 18 months of unsupervised probation, the judge came down from the bench to shake his hand and to thank him for his service to the country. I did not get that kind of treatment in the Eastern District of Virginia. And to correct Chris, I got 2.5 years in prison, not one. And it was a real honest to God prison. JESSELYN drove me there. She can vouch for it. The other technique that they use is called charge stacking. What they do is, let's say maybe you did commit a crime. They won't charge you with one criminal charge. They'll charge you with 5, 10, 20 felonies. And they'll wait until you go bankrupt. And then they'll come to you and say, look, we'll drop all the charges if you plead guilty to these 1 or 2 counts. It's no wonder that, according to ProPublica, the government wins 98.2% of its cases. 98 point. You know, when I was at the CIA and I was working on Iraq and Saddam Hussein would win 98.2% of the vote, we would laugh and we would say it was fixed. Well, the government wins 98.2% of its cases. We say they're geniuses or that everybody was guilty. You know, there's this joke that everybody in prison is innocent. Well, guess what? I met a lot of guys in prison who are innocent, but who aren't stupid enough to roll the dice, knowing that they have a 98.2% chance of losing. They just take the deal to make the thing go away. That's what I did. You know, there aren't many whistleblowers who are courageous enough to fight them. Tom Drake was courageous enough to fight them, and he won. Jeffrey Sterling was courageous enough to fight them. He lost, but he stood up. So what's the answer to this? You know, the answer is not easy, but in my view, the answer is, besides a wholesale reconstruction of our judicial system, which I would love to see and will never happen ever, is congressional oversight. We haven't had real congressional oversight of this kind of thing really since the 70s, since the mid 70s, you know, with the Church Committee and the Pike Committee. We just haven't had, members of Congress charged with overseeing the intelligence community with the guts to stand up and say when something was wrong. You can't do that. And I'll give you an example, the torture program. I take a lot of criticism. I have taken a lot of criticism over the years for not going through the chain of command like Tom Drake did. Well, besides responding that Tom went through the chain of command exactly as we were taught to do and was the recipient of 9 felony charges because of it. The reason I didn't go through my chain of command was that my chain of command had created the torture program. So what do? I go to Jose Rodriguez and say, hey, Jose, this torture program that you created and that you're carrying out in the secret prison, I'm against it. Oh, come on, that's a joke. But why didn't I go to Congress? Because Congress authorized the torture program, because Congress appropriated money for the torture program, and because Congress agreed to keep the program compartmentalized so that nobody would find out about it. That has to change. There has to be somewhere where a whistleblower can go to report evidence of waste, fraud, abuse, illegality, or threats to the public health or public safety. That's what democracy is all about, right? It is illegal to classify a crime. If something is a crime, if a program, a governmental program, is illegal on its face, it is not just legal and permissible to blow the whistle on it, it's your duty to blow the whistle on it. Well, in a perfect world, that's what would happen. In the imperfect world in which we live, we're prosecuted for it. I've spoken to Ed Snowden over the last 6 months or so, and he said something that I think was very important. He said that he has always been willing to come home. He's always been willing to face arrest, and he's willing to go to prison if he is allowed to stand up in court to tell the American people why he did what he did. That's called an affirmative defense. When my attorneys asked my judge, Judge Leonie Brinkema, about an affirmative defense, because I wanted to get up and tell the jury why I did what I did, her response was, not in a million years. And that's the same response that Ed Snowden is getting. So if we're going to change anything, we're not going to see wholesale reform in the judicial system. We're not going to see members of Congress suddenly grow a pair and stand up to the intelligence community. At the very least, we should allow an affirmative defense. And what that would entail would be an amendment, at least to the Espionage Act. Now remember, except for technical amendments, the Espionage Act hasn't been updated since 1917, when it was passed to combat German saboteurs during the First World War. The Espionage Act doesn't even mention the words classified information because it was passed 2 generations before the classification system was even invented. So we need an amendment or a standalone bill on Capitol Hill that will allow national security whistleblowers to face the American people and to explain why they did what they did. Until then, there can't be justice in whistleblowing. Thank you. I hope I kept it to 12 minutes.
Great. That was terrific. Thank you very much. And there'll be time for questions after. So we'll turn to Kathy Kelly now. And she's going to speak to us about the drone war and the ravages of American wars she's witnessed.
Okay, so and before we turn to Kathy, we will play a short video showing drone strikes accompanied with actual real-time drone crew transcript reenacted and the victims' testimonies. This will be a short excerpt from the documentary called National Bird. And by the way, the previous snippet clip from the documentary silenced, and we'll have a link to all of these videos as when we put up the recording of the webinar. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and then show that snippet from National Bird.
Looks like people in the back will pick up. 1, 2, 3, at least 5 things so far. That truck might be a beautiful target.
Yeah. Screener said at least one child in your SUV.
Bullshit, where? Send me a fucking still. I don't think they have case out of this hour. I know they're shady, but come on.
They're reviewing. Never do that shit. Why do you say possible child? Why are they so quick to call fucking kids but not to call them fucking rifles?
I really doubt that children call, man. I really fucking hate that. 6 of a third vehicle on their train.
Guilty by association. They're going to do something nefarious.
همین زمانی که مودمو یک سایکلان هستن همونج پولی مثلا پایین شدی همه در نماز تلا شدی زن و نماز خواندیم از اونجا که حرکت کردیم دیگه همی صدای بونگک در گوش ما میامد ولی خود چیزی که هوا آلوده بود دیده نمیشد اما صدایش ما میشنید
چیز بود رنگی سیاه داشت یکی دیگه سفید بودم تا بینگ او بینگ میزدم بینگ میزد دور تا دور میخورد
اینه که ما برها شنیدیم که امی تیاری به پیلوت که در هوا میگشتن او بسیار به فضای بلند به شب تاریک او خود ما دل ما نمینجا درد داره که تو برای دیگه چیزای دیگه مثلا تو فرق میکنی که مثلا این سوزن هست این مورچه هست ولی برای ما انسان هایی که مثلا کلیش در دکسن سوار بود که دکسن اون در بایدیش سوار بودم پناهی هم نیست که تو از بالا بگی مثلا من ندیدم توی در بایدیش سوار بودم تو ندیدی که همهش مسافر هستن همهش زن باشه هستن
Adolescent near the rear of the SUV.
Well, can't fight.
Pick up a weapon and you're a combatant. That's how that works. Jack 25, Kirk 97, be advised. All packs are finishing up praying and rallying up near all three vehicles at this time.
Oh, sweet target. I try to go for the bed, but it's right dead center of the back.
Oh, that'd be perfect. Jack 25, our screeners are currently calling 21 military-age males, no females, and 2 possible children. How copy?
Roger.
When we say children, we talking teenagers or toddlers?
I would say about 12, not toddlers. Something more towards adolescent or teenagers.
We'll pass that along to the ground for you, Commander. But like I said, 12, 13 years old, a weapon, this is dangerous.
Oh, we agree, yeah.
What's the master plan, fellas? I don't know. Hope we get to shoot the truck with all the dudes in it.
Yeah. Sensors in, let the party begin.
All right, so the plan is, man, we're going to watch this thing go down. The helos are going to take out as much as they can, and when they Winchester, we can play cleanup.
AMC.
Yes?
Remember, kill chain.
Will do.
Roger. And, oh, there it goes.
Engagement.
Stand by.
مو مسافرين بس وقتها شدين دیگه پایان شدیم دیگه بس ماشین ها استاپ کردیم پایان شدیم بس پایان شدیم بس ماشین نیدیم بالا زد بس مو سیاسرها که گفته مردا گفته که این سیاسرها بدر شنا نمیزنه یا نمیزنه بس مو 3 سیاسر بودیم بدر شدیم که ام زد
They took the first and the last out. They're going to come back around.
این ماشین زمینی که اطلاس بشن باید قدر شده یه پایین کردیم کشم که اطلاس پایین میکرد یا
Looks like they're surrendering. They're not running.
Dude, this is weird.
They hit it. It's gotta be. Oh, shit. I don't know about this. It's weird.
That lady's carrying a kid, huh? Maybe. No.
Yeah.
The baby, I think on the right. Yeah. And that is a firm for Kirk 97. Since the engagement, we have not been able to PID any weapons.
Okay. On that somber note, Kathy, we'll introduce Kathy Kelly, and who can talk about the impacts of drone warfare. Go ahead, Kathy.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of the people who have organized this webinar. We've already learned so much. You know, in the Daikundi province of Afghanistan, it's really very unusual for women to leave their village. And so what an excitement it would have been for those women and children to be on board a convoy that was going to go for medical care and for shopping in these big, huge markets in Kabul. And Andrew Coburn wrote in the London Review of Books that they were so excited they were bringing turkeys to relatives in Kabul. And the people who were viewing the footage as the drone was collecting information thought that those turkeys must be evidence of weapons. And then we learned later they were gifts that they were bringing. You know, I quick put on a button that says Gaza as we now watch this horrific assault on civilians in Gaza. And I recall, along with Anne Wright, having been in Gaza in 2009, and I happened to get in. I was in right between the New York Times and the LA Times, and I think my barcode for the ID I had was probably Mott's applesauce or something, but we managed to create press passes, and several of us went in while the 2009 bombing was still going on, and it was horrific. And we had seen the drones circling overhead while we were waiting to get into Gaza. Well, and I've seen this happen in other war zones as well. A ceasefire is declared, and the children, they pulled me outside. They were so excited to be able to go out again. And immediately they found a tarp, and they started heaping on the tarp brush fire and twigs, brushwood and twigs, because they knew their mother would want to start a fire and be able to cook a meal. And they were gleaming. They were so happy pulling that tarp along. And an elderly fellow came up to me and he said, you know, you might be wondering why we don't help those children pick up the branches. And I was kind of puzzled. And then he looked up in the sky and he said, if I pick up a branch, those drones might think I'm picking up a weapon. And that's the kind of situation of anxiety and control and fear that people live in underneath drone warfare, and they cannot escape, particularly in Gaza. They certainly can't escape. I'm mindful of what Phyllis Bennis wrote very recently in Foreign Policy in Focus, that the people who manufacture weapons right now are very focused on Gaza, because now they can say as those weapons are used, oh, it's battle proven. And so they're actually making money as this goes on. And we should pay very close attention to what kinds of robotic weapons the Israelis will be experimenting with as they continue to attack Gaza. In so many war zones, while we are not able to get information because it's classified and the CIA doesn't have to disclose, and many new restrictions were put in place so that people in the United States cannot easily learn about the consequences or the numbers of drone attacks. Some very, very brave people, for instance, in Yemen, with the group Muatana for Human Rights, have risked their lives to gather up this information. And so in the report, Death Falling from the Skies, Civilian Harm from the United States Use of Lethal Force in Yemen, they examined 12 aerial strikes that the US made against civilians in Yemen just between 2017 and 2019. And 10 of these strikes were drone strikes. And often, as we saw in the video, they hit vehicles on the road. And from that report, we learned that the slain victims were fishers, beekeepers, students, teachers, housewives. And every time a life is lost, the ongoing trauma, people are left without a breadwinner. People are left to be in fear because they hear the hum in the skies above. People are left with their inability to support their futures now that their jobs have been eliminated. And so I think particularly of a story Nick Turse told in 2012 about a very fiery Yemeni cleric who'd just given a sermon denouncing Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula for operating in Yemen. And then 2 officials and 3 strangers came to talk to him. And he tried to avoid them all day. He didn't want to have a conversation with them. But finally, he found a policeman to go with him. And the 2 of them went out to talk with the 3 strangers and the officials. And while the town villagers watched in horror, a drone hit that small gathering of conversants, and the cleric and the policeman and the 3 strangers were all killed. And his nephew tells that story and says that they have lived with constant fear ever since. Well, also in Yemen, we should pay attention to the fact that the United States is now selling the United Arab Emirates 18 Reaper drones. Now, these are the ones that are outfitted not only with 2 Hellfire missiles, but also a 500-pound bomb. And that's along with 50 F-35s. And the United Arab Emirates in Yemen has contributed, amongst other war crimes, I believe, the construction of underground clandestine prisons where ghastly torture happens. And so it just compounds a sense of green lighting torture, green lighting killing of civilians, and not asking very many questions even later. I have a young Afghan friend whose brother-in-law was with other friends celebrating the fact that they had finished their studies and they were in a garden, they were enjoying tea together, and they were dressed in typical Pashtun dress, and all of a sudden they heard buzzing in the skies above, and then the drone hit that gathering, and my friend's brother-in-law was killed. And he asked me to talk with his mother. So I was on the phone listening to her, and she was enraged in her anguish. And she said, "Why do they kill him? What is the crime? Who is the criminal? And who is going to provide now for his children? And for me, I am an old woman." And I think those words, and I've heard them echoed before, who is the terrorist? Who is the criminal? People try to voice those words, and if we don't listen, if we don't hear it, it's to our own peril. You know, back in 2006, I'd honestly never heard of a drone before, knew nothing. And I was in Lebanon, and we went into the funeral of people in the town of Hana. This was an Israeli Hezbollah war. The Israelis had used many, many airstrikes. And in this town, people who had bought their children for safety to a particular building saw in horror that that building itself was targeted. And so at the funeral, the mother of one of the little girls, she was 4 years old, I'm saying, and she asked her son to bring a picture of her daughter. And she showed it to me. And there was a little girl with, big brown eyes and tousled hair, a very serious expression. You could imagine her smile. And then the mother tapped the plastic over the picture, and she asked me, "Who is the terrorist? Is she the terrorist?" And then she pointed above, and it was hard for her because she was wearing a medical hood and a brace. She herself had been injured. And she said, "Didn't they know? Didn't they see? My little girl, I pick her up every morning. I swing her. I fix her breakfast." And I wasn't sure who she meant by they. And it was later I realized she was pointing to the drones up above. Didn't they know? Didn't they see? Daniel Hale knew. Daniel Hale saw. He spoke up. He should be thanked. From the bottom of our hearts, thanked. And instead he is, no doubt, feeling tremendous pressure and anxiety and fear in solitary confinement. So let us express our solidarity, catch courage from one another, and keep speaking up. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Kathy, for sharing those terrible, terrible details of the experiences of people attacked by drones. So Daniel Hale tried to do this, the right thing, and expose the drone warfare. And so what we're going to see next is a short clip from the same documentary called National Bird. And this is going to show Daniel Hale's experience, all as part of an introduction to JESSELYN Radack's talk. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen here, and I will share. Let's see if it's this one. Okay. Sorry, that was the wrong one. Technical difficulties here. Let's see if I can find the other one. Here it is. No. Okay, can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you see where it says August 8th, 2014?
Yes.
Just hours after I returned in my badge and was finishing off. I had gotten home, was relaxing, had poured myself a drink, and somebody downstairs was knocking at the door, and immediately both people at the door, man and woman, shoved FBI badges in my face, pushed me inside into the kitchen, and immediately behind them came, I'd say, about 20 agents, basically all of them with pistols drawn, some wearing body armor. And at this point, I'm extremely scared. I didn't understand what was going on. Altogether, I think there might have been at least 30 to 50 agents in and out of the house at different points throughout the evening, taking photos of every room and of everything, searching for different things. Once they were done, they left, and I didn't even have a phone on me. So I had retained a number. One of the agents allowed me to retrieve a number from my phone, and then I used that to call my friends in DC to ask them if they could help me get in touch with the right people that knew how to deal with these kinds of cases.
Once I was in touch with Daniel, we met at one location and promptly moved to another location, and he started telling me what was going on, and it became very apparent that he had been subject to search warrants that he had brought with him and showed me. And I drafted up an attorney-client agreement, a temporary one, on a napkin, so I could provide immediate representation, and then eventually was able to do a full agreement with him. But he was terrified.
Everything that we know so far between me and my attorneys, I've been keeping in here, and it's basically just the warrants that were issued that day and the items that they took. And so there were 3 warrants issued, one for the room of the house that I was in and the house itself. There's a warrant issued for me and my smartphone that I may have in my possession. There's one for my motorcycle, and then there's a list of all the things that they took. So basically there was a list for electronics, and then there was a list for papers. The next was just an explanation of what they were looking for. So under category 1, information documents in a format or medium, all originals, computer files, copies, and manipulated versions of that are the property of the United States government or any agency of the United States government, including the NSA, the NGA, JSOC, the Department of Defense, the Department of the Air Force. All classified information, materials, or documents are defined in 18 U.S.C. 1924. So those 5 departments or agencies, however you look at them, those are all places I have worked for. 793E and 1030A1, 1030A2B, and 1924. So I'd have to actually do some research on that, and I should have probably done that if I were more responsible for myself. But I'm pretty sure, that all just entails a generic blanket. This is a criminal investigation for the Espionage Act.
The Espionage Act is one of the most serious charges you can level against an American. It's like treason. It's that serious because basically it paints you as an enemy of the state. And it's a David versus Goliath struggle. It is a single person against the entire executive branch of the United States government. And that's the kind of power we're supposed to reserve for going after our enemies, not after people who are patriotic.
Okay, that was a short snippet from the documentary called National Bird. And with that, we'll turn it over to JESSELYN RADACK.
Hi, thank you for having me and for hosting this. The Espionage Act is a World War I era law from 1917. It was very famously used to go after Daniel Ellsberg in the 1970s, and in a case that ended up collapsing because of government misconduct. And then the law lay virtually dormant for a number of decades until the Obama administration dusted it off and started using this antiquated law to go after whistleblowers. And it was a very, very disturbing trend because this law, not only, as John said, it was passed long before you even had the word classification, but it also is something called a strict liability law, meaning you either made a disclosure or not. It doesn't matter why. Your intent doesn't matter. So if you're a spy and you sold secrets to another country for revenge or for profit, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're a whistleblower who revealed information to the media because you thought it was an evidence of a war crime or illegal secret surveillance or illegal torture or illegal drone strikes. Like, none of that comes into play. It doesn't matter what your motive was. If you disclosed information to the media, you are guilty, and it has incredibly stringent penalties. So one count in a conviction can land you in jail for 10 years. It's incredibly drastic. I mean, there are a number of other laws that can be used to go after people for unauthorized disclosures of classified information. But again, they have much shorter sentences. And so the government deliberately choosing to use this very arcane and very severe law on whistleblowers is meant to send a message to other people thinking of blowing the whistle. And it's also meant to exert maximum punishment. Literally, you have defendants who are fighting essentially with, they're blindfolded and with their arms tied behind their back because they're not allowed to say why they went to the media in the first place. And if you look at the people who are being prosecuted, it's because they disclosed information that was embarrassing to the US government, or even worse, showed that the US government was involved in criminal activity like torture, and or that the US government had lied to the public and to Congress about its involvement in those activities. So Daniel Hale, his case actually, search warrants were executed at his house back in 2014, but the case lay dormant for nearly 7 years. I mean, zero activity in the case, and me and the other original attorney thought it was just, they had not formally dismissed it, but there was no activity. So we thought it was dead on the vine. So when it was resurrected in 2019, that was a shock to everybody. And it was like, why did this happen? Well, it happened because under President Trump, Jeff Sessions, who had been one of the attorneys general, said, we're going to go after leaks, because Donald Trump had to be in his bonnet about leaks. Even though his administration engaged in a lot of leaks, he had concerns about other people leaking about him. And so in going after leakers, they ended up dusting off all these moldy oldie cases, and decided to go ahead and charge them and indict people. And that's why there was that huge lag before Daniel Hale was actually taken into custody and these charges are actually pursued. So it was a shock to everyone. And it was also a shock that, here's this case that began under one administration that's going to bleed into another and another, and through Trump. And now we have Biden, who's continuing this process because Daniel has not yet been sentenced. And basically, here's a guy whose only crime is basically, adhering to his conscience about incredibly dangerous behavior that the US government had lied about, and that actually was terribly, against all international and human rights laws. 90% of the people who were killed in this program were not the intended target. And that's a huge revelation. But when you look at what Daniel is accused of having disclosed, it was about these overbroad targeting lists and about the government not getting its objective most of the time, and about innocent civilians being killed, and the US government underreporting those numbers and exaggerating the number of so-called bad guys that it was able to get. So I think Daniel's disclosures were incredibly important to the public interest, but I thought they were also embarrassing to the government and gave the government a black eye. And the government literally, is going after him, knowing that under the Espionage Act, if you're facing, 50 years in jail for 5 counts of Espionage Act, if you take a plea deal that, would get you something, under 10 years and more likely to be in the 2.5 to 5 year range, it pretty much is a foregone conclusion that you're going to plead out to, to one of those counts or a couple of those counts to avoid spending the rest of your life in jail. And we saw that with John Kiriakou and with Jeffrey Sterling and a number of the other public servants who've literally taken plea deals under this law so that they could get out and still have a life in front of them. And these are people, with families that care about them and friends that care about them and who were serving their country and did serve their country. Daniel served in Afghanistan. He is a veteran. He is a war veteran. He is a disabled war veteran. And this is who the government is prosecuting because he talked about stuff that was being reported in the media by human rights organizations, but he actually talked about it from the inside, and they're going to make an example of him, and that's what's going on. And he is the most conscientious, peaceful people I know. And it's tragic to me that over and over again, you get very thoughtful people who I would argue are the kind of people you want to be public servants, and people like Tom Drake and Edward Snowden and John Kiriakou and Jeffrey Sterling and now Daniel Hale. These are the kind of people you would want to be serving our country, but instead you're going after them because they took their oath to the Constitution more seriously than they took some secrecy agreement that the government made them sign and then used it to hide illegal activity. So I appreciate the attention to Daniel's case. He took the plea just to avoid an even greater uncertainty after having been under this sort of Damocles for some 6 to 7 years. And now he faces sentencing. But even that was not enough for the government. They called him in for a meeting with his probation officer, supposedly because they had a concern, about his mental health. And instead, they took him into custody and put him in jail, which, if someone is depressed and anxious, which, generally anyone who's a defendant in this kind of case would be. And Daniel, I don't think, has hidden his struggles in that regard. But to take them into custody for their own well-being and then put them in solitary, in isolation, which is known to lead to suicidal ideation. It's madness. It's madness. And obviously, Daniel Hale wasn't able to tie up the loose ends in his life before going to prison. He knew that looked like it would eventually be the inevitable outcome, but normally that would be determined at sentencing, and then he would have to report to a prison by a certain date, but he would have a chance to get his affairs in order, to say goodbye to his friends, to find someone to look after his cat. These are all very real things that Daniel was not able to do. And it was just, in my opinion, a power play on the part of the government that was just overly punitive to start punishing him before the punishment even began, and as if he has not been punished for the past 7 years, living under this horrible cloud. So it's, again, this is on the Biden administration. They could drop this case. They could recommend leniency. There are a number of things they could do. And like with Reality Winner, another whistleblower who is still in jail, it's been radio silence from them. So while the government talks a good game about the importance of transparency and the importance of a free press, their actions completely belie that. You have whistleblowers in jail. Well, people, look at Reality Winner. People who actually engaged in Russian disinformation campaigns are walking free. And the one person who tried to blow the whistle on it has been in jail for coming on 5 years. And Daniel's is another case. I mean, here's someone who tried to do the right thing and reveal illegal conduct that we had been involved in. And now they're going after him and trying to put him in jail, which will come with all sorts of conditions that guarantee he has to keep his mouth shut while in jail and afterwards. And it sends the most chilling of messages to whistleblowers out there. So I appreciate your program bringing some light to this. There's been a virtual media blackout and very little coverage of this case. Again, because basically it looks terrible for any president to be prosecuting US citizens for Espionage Act when they didn't engage in spy activity, but rather just went to the media, which is their First Amendment right.
Very good. Thank you so much, JESSELYN and Kathy and John for your presentations. Very interesting material for us to go over and to let settle in. We have a series of questions for you guys, some of which are coming in through the chat. So why don't we take this time to open it up for questions. If people want to go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll vet them for the speakers. Thank you very much. All right, so the first question from Ann Wilcox is, can whistleblower protection laws be applied to national security cases, strengthened through efforts of Marsha Coleman, Abedayo, and others?
I can say that normally you would think whistleblower laws would protect national security and intelligence whistleblowers, but there is a carve out in those laws for precisely that category. And even though the most significant disclosures have come from national security and intelligence whistleblowers over the past decade, they really have little to zero protection. They're specifically excluded from the main whistleblower protection law. And then there's an intelligence community whistleblower protection law that basically lets you blow the whistle inside the system to your superiors who are engaged in the wrongdoing. And that law is notorious now for being used to entrap whistleblowers and go after them. So instead of going after the wrongdoer, they end up going after the person who reported the wrongdoing.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you. So our next question is from Sam, I believe. We are at the beginning of the Biden administration, which in some ways feels like a return to the Obama era, when there was a real war on whistleblowers and aggression against the media who reported these leaks. Perhaps even more Trump-appointed judges. What does the legal terrain look like today? And what does a public campaign to help them look like? And I would simply add that, as John said in the beginning, that we're really limited in what we can do legally. Perhaps what we need to be really putting a lot of effort into is education and organizing and mobilizing.
Absolutely. I should mention there is a Stand With Daniel Hale website, standwithdanielhale.org, which has information about actions you can take to help him. Code Pink also has something up that we cross-reference on the standwithdanielhale.org website about ways that you can write to him, ways that you can support him and help spread the word about what's going on. But I agree, the legal landscape is bleak. And so it very much depends on things like this particular program and other media paying attention and bothering to cover this. And the government is going to do everything it can to keep this out of the news. So the more people cover it, the more people talk about it, the better. And I'm grateful that John and other people who've been through the ringer under this horrible law are still willing, despite the hardship that they suffered, are still willing to speak out. And it speaks to the gross injustice of this law, but also how paralyzing it can be when you're going through it. So I know during John's case, Tom Drake spoke out, and during Daniel's case, both John and Tom and Ed Snowden have all spoken out about it. It's important that we continue raising our voices about it and trying to educate people about it, because the Espionage Act, I don't even know if it could be amended to add a public interest defense, but in my opinion, the whole thing should be repealed. There are other laws to deal with what the government might consider unauthorized disclosures of information, and they are specifically using this very heavy-handed law to go after Daniel and to go after Assange and to go after Reality Winner. Similar version of it was used to go after Chelsea Manning, but the military version of it, Tom, John, Jeff Sterling, all these people have made Terry Albury, incredibly significant disclosures that benefited the public. And even the government admitted, Obama towards, the end of his administration, like almost, in his commutation of Chelsea Manning, almost, seemed to kind of maybe see a glimmer of the light that this was very unproductive and looked terrible from a Democratic point of view. Yet, unfortunately, the precedent that was created during the Obama years, I said, what will this power look like in the hands of someone you don't trust? And then we had Trump. And that's what it looks like, because he picked it up and continued using this power in awful ways to go after political enemies. And now we have Biden, and he's just continuing. In Daniel Hale's case and in Reality Winner's case, he could do things to try to step this back. And he's not. It's just more of the same. It's a bipartisan issue. It doesn't matter if you're a Democratic or a Republican control, because this is all ultimately about government control. And in a democracy, the people are supposed to control the government, not the other way around.
Absolutely. John, you wanted to add to that?
Wow, I don't think I could improve on that at all. JESSELYN is exactly right. This is not a partisan issue. It's never been a partisan issue. When Donald Trump was first elected, I got a call from a reporter who said she had spoken to JESSELYN and to Tom Drake, and she asked if I had any hope for the Trump administration. And I foolishly said that I just couldn't imagine things getting any worse, no matter who was president, than they were with Barack Obama. And of course they got worse. Something like 6 times the number of leak investigations. And then poor Reality Winner got the longest sentence of any of the national security whistleblowers. So now Donald Trump is out of office. Joe Biden is in office, and the Justice Department is still doing those leak investigations. They are still going after whistleblowers like Daniel Hale, like Julian Assange, and there's no end in sight to any of this.
Very good. Perhaps we have the time, and maybe we could open it up so that people can actually articulate their own questions. So the next question we have up, Steve, do you want to go ahead and articulate your question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. JESSELYN, I have this question. The text, the actual text of the Espionage Act says that the intent of the intent of the defendant is relevant. It requires that the defendant intend to injure the United States. How can whistleblower lawyers allow judges to get away with ignoring the actual language of the statute. It's so clear.
Judges grafted an intent requirement on it many decades ago to try to keep it legal and in keeping with other criminal laws where intent, of course, is relevant in pretty much every other criminal law. But judges have, the case law basically says that you cannot raise intent during the case in chief. The only time you can raise intent, your intent and your good intentions, if you had them, is during sentencing, which again assumes you've already been found guilty. So during sentencing, now we have a number of people who are writing letters to the judge and their sentencing memos and briefs, amici briefs that are being submitted, talking about Daniel Hale as a person and what his good intentions were and what he was trying to do. But during the case in chief, they do not let that in. In fact, you can't even use, often words like classified are not allowed in. It's so restrictive. The entire hearings for Daniel, even when they didn't involve classified information, were still closed to the public. And I know that sounds Kafkaesque and like that couldn't happen, but it happened over and over. Even, where I, as an attorney who was there were times I was locked out of the courtroom because I didn't have a security clearance, even if they weren't talking about classified. So, you can have any words on paper in the law, that you had to have intended to harm the US or benefit a foreign nation. But when the case law and all the precedent says that can't come in, that's the reality. And if you ask any defendant during the case in chief, of their actual legal proceeding, if they could talk about their intent, the answer is no, practically. So,
but again, as a non-lawyer, you're talking about allocution statements after the fact. It doesn't really do much good. If the statute says, and I'm quoting now, it says that the defendant has to have the purpose of obtaining information respecting blah 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 to be used to the injury of the United States or the advantage of a foreign nation. If the government cannot prove that, then there is no case. That's the actual words of the statute. So you say precedent and case law. Why aren't the lawyers simply appealing that? The judge can't say that black is white.
Well, they have appealed it. These issues have been appealed up to the circuit court level, and circuit courts have affirmed all these cases, mind you. The majority of them, with the exception of Reality Winner and maybe one or two others, have taken place in the Eastern District of Virginia, which is the most conservative court in this country and which has monopoly jurisdiction on these cases because the Pentagon is located in Virginia, and most of the people who are working for the CIA, like the one NSA case, Tom Drake's, which had a better outcome, that was in Maryland. But most of these cases are in Virginia, in the Eastern District. And people have tried to make all these arguments to the judges about the unconstitutionality of the Espionage Act, the fact that it is contradictory to the First Amendment, the fact that it is impossible to mount a defense during the actual trial of the case about what your intent was. These arguments have been made and rejected by that court. They've been rejected on appeal, and the Supreme Court has not granted certiorari in any of these cases, and most of them end up pleading out, before they would get elevated that high. And so I don't know that the Supreme Court will ever have a chance to weigh in. Basically, it's a law that needs to be amended in a big way to add a public interest defense or repealed because it's antiquated and heavy-handed and being used to go after media sources. That's its main use.
Wouldn't that point the direction of a new approach to defending whistleblowers? In other words, there are states that have passed laws that there are
Yeah.
states that
Okay,
have passed.
just finish up, Steve, and then we're going to move on to Todd. Go ahead.
Okay,
And there's
there
also
are states that have passed laws requiring necessity defense, which is similar to an affirmative defense. There are laws that prevent judges from restricting bringing up jury nullification. If publicity were spread across the whole country that jury nullification is a possibility, which most people don't know about, this would help in court. In other words, forget the judges, go directly to the public and force public opinion to make the judges change their mind. They read the headlines.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve. All right, so Todd, you're up next.
So a combination of a question and a comment, if I may. And the comment is coming from my own experience as a Guantanamo defense attorney, going back to 2008, and I'm still involved on an appellate case, which of course is been upheld, even though we won on a couple convictions. The main one, conspiracy, has been upheld. And the point being is, and I'll ask John and JESSELYN their comment perhaps, but we're refusing to see the true nature of what the Espionage Act is, I would argue. And I had to do extensive research into military commissions and martial law because of the cases I was on. And the Espionage Act is merely an extension when military commissions had fell out of favor after the Civil War and World War I came along and they wanted to suppress anti-dissent. They codified martial law. And that's the same thing that Germany had done even before the Nazis, but the Nazis took it to the extreme. And an excellent book written on it is by Ernst Fraenkel, a German Jewish lawyer, where he wrote that the martial law was the constitution of the National Socialist state. And if you look at it, and that's why none of these appeals, these arguments work, because it's outside the rule of law. It's basically martial law, but codified martial law. And until we begin calling it what it really is, really a form of fascism. And again, I've seen it firsthand at Guantanamo. That's what the military commissions are. I've seen it firsthand. Until we really call it by its true nature, I don't think we have any luck, any prospect of success in changing people's minds and the need for getting rid of this, because we're allowing ourselves to be, maintained under martial law on national security issues. So maybe John, particularly, you've done time, but JESSELYN as well. And as long as we're going to remain a warfare state, this is going to stay in effect, believe me. That's the nature of war, to suppress anti-dissent, lest it weaken the will. And this is a terminology DOD and all these theorists use. They'll weaken the will if we actually know what's really going on.
That's a very good point. And JESSELYN can confirm the story that I'm going to tell you. I was actually heartened going into court for the first time because I had done so much research on Tom Drake's case. And in Tom Drake's case, his judge ruled that the government had to prove that he had the intent to damage the national security, which of course he didn't. So we went into court and my attorneys said to Judge Leonie Brinkema, Your Honor, this court in the District of Maryland ruled that Mr. Drake, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, I've decided not to respect that precedent. And my lawyer said, Your Honor, are you saying that someone can commit espionage by accident? And she said, that's exactly what I'm saying. And she looked at me and she said, Mr. Kiriakou, you either did it or you didn't do it, and you did it. So we walked out of court and I said to my lawyers, what just happened in there? And one of them said, we just lost the case. That's what happened. So you don't have a chance. You don't have a chance for exactly the reason that Todd just elucidated, because these hearings are similar to military tribunals. This is how the country decided to go under the Obama administration, how the Justice Department decided to go. And when I said to my attorneys, well, can we appeal this? And they said, sure, we can appeal it post-conviction. But if we don't come to some sort of plea agreement, you're going to get 12 to 18 years. So do you really want to wait and appeal? That's an easy one.
Thank you. Thank you, John. All right. So up next, we have Z Rasa. Do you want to go ahead and give your question, Z?
Yes, my question is a relatively simple one. Is there any official channel for whistleblowers like Daniel Hale, or really anyone in general who are incarcerated, to be able to voice the abuses that they're experiencing in federal prison or probation? And really, how effective are those channels? And I guess on top of that, we know that Daniel Hale is now incarcerated under solitary confinement. Is there any chance that he's able to exit and go back on probation before he is sentenced?
Great questions. Jess, do you mind if I take the first part?
Please go right ahead.
The answer really is yes and no. When I was incarcerated, I sort of accidentally fell into a blog. So JESSELYN had mentioned to me that there were a lot of people who wanted to know how I was doing once I went away to prison, and that once I felt comfortable, I should write her a letter so that she could circulate it among my supporters. So about 6 weeks after I got to prison, I wrote this letter, which I called a letter from Loretto, because I very arrogantly was trying to compare it to the letter from Birmingham jail. And I sent it to Jess, not realizing that Jess traveled in circles that included Arianna Huffington. And once Arianna published it, it got millions and millions of hits. And in the 2 weeks afterwards, I ended up giving interviews to everybody from CNN and ABC News to Playboy and the Atlantic Monthly and a half a dozen foreign outlets. I realized immediately that I had a voice that I didn't realize previously I had or had access to. And so I decided to write this series, Letters from Loretto, that I had to smuggle out to Jess. And then Jess would get them to Kevin Gastala, now of Shadowproof, back then of Firedog Lake. And people read these things, important people. Jake Tapper from CNN came to the prison to interview me. I became a star in the Greek media. I gave interviews to every Greek national newspaper, 3 interviews to NPR. And what that did is it served to protect me inside the prison. There was one particularly awful guard. He had a reputation for violence, for racism, particularly bad. He never, ever bothered me, never. And one of my friends in prison mentioned casually to him, "Oh, I heard you're going to be on Central 1 unit for the next quarter. My friend John's on Central 1. And he said, "Is that the CIA guy?" My friend said, "Yes." And he said, "Man, I never mess with that guy." And my friend said, "Really? Why not?" And he said, "Because that's all I need. I work my 8-hour shift and I go to my car and CNN's waiting for me. No thanks." So it saved me from the guards having this access to the media. I did a Freedom of Information Act request on myself with the Bureau of Prisons, just out of curiosity, just to see what they had. Very quickly, they sent me about 250 pages worth of material, and most of it was garbage. It was my medical records, my visitors list, but there were several important pieces of paper, all of which were stamped at the top and bottom, FOIA exempt, do not release to inmate. So either somebody was stupid or they took pity on me and decided that I really needed to know what was being said about me behind my back. Well, these memos included one from the warden in big block letters. It said, "Caution, inmate has access to the media." And that's really what it all came down to. They couldn't stop me. And for a while, they were shaking me down almost every day. They would throw my pictures of my children on the floor and walk on them. They would dump all my food onto the floor to try to intimidate me, to get me to stop writing. They threatened me with solitary confinement. And finally, I said to the warden, I said, "I have gone nose to nose with Al-Qaeda, with Hezbollah, with the Iranians, and I'm supposed to be afraid of you and you're solitary? I lived in Yemen." And he backed off. So this is what I've told Daniel. There are a lot of people that are worried about him. There are a lot of people who support him. And as hard as it might be, and it'll get easier once he's out of this terrible local lockup, he's got to put everything on paper and get it out there to as wide an audience as is possible. I learned this valuable lesson with JESSELYN, and I recommend it to everybody. This is the same thing I told Jeffrey Sterling. It's the same thing I told Terry Albury. You have to get your side of the story out there. You know, I will say one thing. It's about the only nice thing I can say about my ex-wife. But she said to me one day, right before I went to prison, she said, they have consistently underestimated your resolve. You have to keep writing about this because eventually they're going to move on to the next whistleblower, which they did. It was Ed Snowden in the summer of 2013. But she said, if you keep talking about your case, your side of the story is going to be the side of record. And that's exactly what happened. Daniel has to do the same thing.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our time allotment here. King Downing, do you want to throw in your last question there?
I'm just unmuting. Thank you all for your courage and also for your work. And my question was, and I'm sorry, I don't think I really wrote it that well. Ratified international conventions are the law of the land. Oh, by the way, I'm with WBAI Radio, so I'm glad to cover this. Ratified international conventions are the law of the land. Is there a way to cite these conventions against government violations as part of the defense? Would international law, quote, trump, pun intended, federal espionage statutes?
We've tried that in other cases. You're absolutely right that international laws are crystal clear about solitary confinement and that being inhumane, and crystal clear about conditions of prisons and that kind of thing. But unfortunately, US case law has held, and a lot of this Todd could speak to, but came from the Guantanamo cases. You know, they've said we don't need to abide by international law. It's, you know, you're welcome to cite it, but we don't have to follow it. So there were all, I mean, technically they have to follow Geneva Conventions, but there are a whole bunch of other treaties and covenants that are out there that would prohibit what's happening in these cases. And I feel like, having taught legal ethics and international law on this stuff, the US's position is we don't have to follow this, but Todd can speak to that too.
Can I say a word?
Sure.
I was just getting ready to type a text in, but a chat. But anyway, but that's a very good point, because we're up against a massive information operation. It's an information operation being run by the United States government and its various think tanks, constantly framing the argument in a way that we're all under threat. We're all going to be attacked tomorrow unless we allow the CIA and military to do all these things. And the only way, any hope that there is of countering this information operation is by providing accurate information about what's really being done, including the information operation being waged by the US government against the American people, because that's their ultimate target in destroying the Constitution and getting out from under legal obligations. And, an international audience too is extremely valuable. I mean, the whole point, and I'll end it right here, so the point is, in wartime, is you always want to maintain an appearance of legitimacy. And that's a key word in understanding why this is all done. And that's what whistleblowers do. They undermine legitimacy, which is why they're targeted. But the point is, the truth has to get out, and that helps to legitimize our arguments against the government's despotic measures. I'll stop there. So.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Todd. Very, very, very interesting. Thank you all for joining this webinar, and especially we want to give our sincere thanks to our speakers for giving their time today, but also all the work that they're doing. And so on behalf of all of us at Covert Action, we want to thank everybody for coming, and we need to continue this work, and we need to continue this conversation, and continue doing the best we can to defend and empower whistleblowers, and providing a voice for those who speak truth to power, all in an effort to both educate and ultimately organize, as what has been one of the conclusions of this webinar, people around the world about the dirty tricks of US imperialism and nefarious activities of plutocrats worldwide. Sam, do you want to finish it up?
Yeah, sure. I just want to say one quick note. I want to echo the thanking our speakers here today. And I think that there's one of the problems when we focus on what's happening to the whistleblowers and how whistleblowers are being persecuted is it can be a little depressing and disempowering. They control the courts, they control the state, and sometimes it can feel like we're all alone. I think it's important when we hear about John and Snowden and Chelsea Manning, and when people are reaching out, and Drake, when people are reaching out to each other so people aren't so isolated. And so I think that we need to realize that the persecution of whistleblowers is about the state dealing with the threat of the good example. And we know what those good examples are because there are a lot of the heroes that we look to in our own life. People like Chelsea Manning, people like Julian Assange, people like Craig Murray in England, people like Reality Winner, and now Daniel Hale is being added to this list. And so we thank everybody for coming out for what in some ways is sort of our inaugural webinar with Covert Action, but we don't want you just to be observers. We want you to be participants. So we have 3 points that we sort of want to ask y'all who are listening where we want you to participate. So the first is share the standwithdanielhale.org with everyone that you know, right? If you're on Facebook, share it on Facebook. If you have an email list, put it on your email list. Write a letter to your paper, your local paper about Daniel Hale. Call and write to your local elected official saying, what are we doing about Daniel Hale? This is unacceptable. I think this is wrong, right? And ask everybody within your social network to do that as well, to add on to that. And especially organize a protest where you are, right? Make flyers and hand them out, right? In places where people are walking around. It's when all of us join together that we have power. We're not isolated. They may have the state, but we have solidarity. And then when we do that, when we talk about Daniel Hale's case, it's absolutely critical that we don't just say that we're asking for mercy for Daniel Hale. We're asking to draw, what we want to do is we want to draw attention to what Daniel Hale is being persecuted for. What is happening with the assassination program? What is happening with the use of drones to murder people around the world in our name, and how the court system is being used to persecute the whistleblowers and not the criminals, right? So spread this to your social media, put it out on Facebook, share the website, write the letter, call your elected official. It's really how we're going to have power and gain power in this. And then the last thing is, and this is absolutely true, there needs to be a place for whistleblowers to share what they have. And so Covert Action Magazine is in the midst of a re-blossom, a relaunch, and please share and support what Covert Action Magazine is doing. You all know the website, covertactionmagazine.com. Please support us. We're trying to grow. And we're trying to provide a place for the future Chelsea Mannings, the future Daniel Hales, the future Reality Winners, the future Johns, to have a place that they can share their stuff and not worry it's going to get archived or censored or sent down some kind of memory hole. So again, thanks everybody for coming out, but don't just be an observer. It's time for us all to participate and support those who've blown the whistle for us.
Excellent. All right, let's give a round of applause to everybody. Thanks a lot. All right, so we'll all be in touch, and we'll look forward to seeing you at those online and at the demonstrations. All right, and take care. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye now.